Matigas na Tinapay sa Mainit na Kape. Hello everyone. Welcome back to the channel where we bring the most iconic action stories to life. Today we are diving into a true movie story, Walang Matigas na Tinapay sa Mainit na Kape. Walang Matigas na Tinapay sa Mainit na Kape, 1994, is a Filipino action comedy film starring Fernand Poe Jr., Alice Dixson, and Vandolph. The story follows a hardened street kid named Bucci, who crosses paths with Mike Poe Jr., a former inmate seeking a peaceful life after being wrongfully convicted. Mike finds himself challenged by villains, and Bucci is also helped by his teacher, Dixson. Movie details. Year, 1994. Director, Tony Cruz. Writer, Fernando Poe Jr. Story, Jose Bartolome, Manny A. Buising, and Manny Palo. Screenplay. Main cast. Fernando Poe Jr. as Mike. Alice Dixson as Tess. Vandolph as Bucci. Max Alvarado as Brando. Paquito Diaz as Poldo. Bucci. The film centers on a hardened street kid named Bucci who lives with his abusive aunt and makes a living selling water. He meets the tough but kind-hearted Mike, who is working to live a peaceful life after being released from prison for a crime he was framed for. Mike. After his release, Mike is tracked down by the same villains who framed him, forcing him into a violent confrontation. Development. As the story unfolds, Mike is further influenced by his teacher, Tess, who helps him and Bucci navigate their difficult circumstances. The film blends comedy and action as Mike and Bucci face the villains who are relentlessly pursuing Mike. Action comedy is a hybrid genre that combines elements of action fiction with comedy. While early action films feature stunt work and humor, academic Cynthia King wrote that the genre only came into its own as a mainstay of the American action film genre in the 1980s when actors who had backgrounds in comedies such as Eddie Murphy began taking roles in action films. 1. The genre approaches various narratives and styles such as buddy films, superhero films, and Hong Kong action cinema featuring various actors such as Jackie Chan. Academic Cynthia King said that the action comedy film only came into its own as a mainstay of the American action film genre in the 1980s when actors who had backgrounds in comedies such as Eddie Murphy, began taking roles in action films. 1. Cynthia King referred to action comedy films as typically being reserved for action films where humor plays a much more central role. 6. These films take on several other formats such as buddy films involving mismatched partners such as The Lethal Weapon, 1987 to 1998, and Rush Hour, 1998 to 2006, film series, Hong Kong action cinema through work of actors like Jackie Chan and many others. King also described the more comedic superhero films such as Mystery Men, 1999, Hancock, 2008, and The Green Hornet, 2011, as belonging to the genre. 7. Elements of action comedy films existed in early cinema work such as the chase sequences in pre-1915 films such as The Lone Dale Operator, 1911, provide editing patterns of later action films such as Wheels on Wheels, 1984, date, later silent film comedies such as those featuring Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton such as Easy Street, 1917, and The General, 1926, featured chases, gags, and stunts that would serve as inspirations for both comedic and non-comedic action set pieces in later action films. 9. These films include Chaplin and Keaton using physical materials on stage, either weapons or props, for cause and effect to add force on bodily actions. 10. King wrote that despite a large cinematic history of humor and peril, the action comedy film only came into its own as part of American action film genre in the early 1980s. In spite of the rich theatrical history of humor and peril, action comedy only came into its own as a mainstay of the American action film genre in the 1980s. King highlighted that this happened when actors who had backgrounds in comedies such as Eddie Murphy began taking roles in action films. 1. In his book, Lights, Camera, Action, Crafting an Action Script, 2005, Gregory Sano said that the action comedy film that not all films that contain conflict and humor were action comedies, saying that films that action-laden subplots such as Big Mama's House, 2000, or Dumb and Dumber, 1994, were more straight comedies as the action lacked an integral role in the film's narrative. 11. King echoed this, saying that films are better categorized as straight comedies such as Night at the Museum, 2006, or Loaded Weapon 1, 1993, as most of the action was framed comically with no serious violence or peril. She also said action films that contain sardonic one-liners such as, "Go ahead, make my day," from Sudden Impact, 1983, were not action comedies. 12. Mark Gallagher, in Action Figures, Men, Action Films, and Contemporary Adventure Narratives, 2006, action comedies often feature a fish-out-of-water theme such as Murphy's character clashing with upper-class white communities and conventional police procedures in the Beverly Hills Cop, 1984-2024, film series. Comedy originated in ancient Greece. In Athenian democracy, the public opinion of voters was influenced by political satire performed by comic poets in theaters. 1. The theatrical genre of Greek comedy can be described as a dramatic performance pitting two groups, ages, genders, or societies against each other in an amusing agon or conflict. Northrop Frye depicted these two opposing sides as a society of youth and a society of the old. 2. A revised view characterizes the essential agon of comedy as a struggle between a relatively powerless youth and the societal conventions posing obstacles to his hopes. In this struggle, the youth then becomes constrained by his lack of social authority, and is left with little choice but to resort to ruses which engender dramatic irony, which provokes laughter. 3. Varieties. Satire and political satire use comedy to portray people or social institutions as ridiculous or corrupt, thus alienating their audience from the object of their humor. Parody subverts popular genres and forms, critiquing those forms without necessarily condemning them. Other forms of comedy include screwball comedy, which derives its humor largely from bizarre, surprising, and improbable situations or characters, and black comedy, which is characterized by a form of humor that includes darker aspects of human behavior or human nature. Similarly, scatological humor, sexual humor, and race humor create comedy by violating social conventions or taboos in comic ways, which can often be taken as offensive by the subjects of the joke. A comedy of manners typically takes as its subject a particular part of society, usually upper-class society, and uses humor to parody or satirize the behavior and mannerisms of its members. Romantic comedy is a popular genre that depicts burgeoning romance in humorous terms and focuses on the foibles of those who are falling in love. The Greeks and Romans confined their use of the word comedy to descriptions of stage plays with happy endings. Aristotle defined comedy as an imitation of men worse than the average, where tragedy was an imitation of men better than the average. However, the characters portrayed in comedies were not worse than average in every way, only insofar as they are ridiculous, which is a species of the ugly. The ridiculous may be defined as a mistake or deformity not productive of pain or harm to others. The mask, for instance, that excites laughter is something ugly and distorted without causing pain. 7. In the Middle Ages, the term expanded to include narrative poems with happy endings. It is in this sense that Dante used the term in the title of his poem, La Commedia. As time progressed, the word came more and more to be associated with any sort of performance intended to cause laughter. 6. During the Middle Ages, the term comedy became synonymous with satire, and later with humor in general. Aristotle's Poetics was translated into Arabic in the medieval Islamic world, where it was elaborated upon by Arabic writers and Islamic philosophers, such as Abu Bishr and his pupils Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes. They disassociated comedy from Greek dramatic representation and instead identified it with Arabic poetic themes and forms, such as hijja, satirical poetry. They viewed comedy as simply the heart of reprehension, and made no reference to light and cheerful events, or to the troubling beginnings and happy endings associated with classical Greek comedy. After the Latin translations of the 12th century, the term comedy gained a more general meaning in medieval literature. 8. In the late 20th century, many scholars preferred to use the term laughter to refer to the whole gamut of the comic, in order to avoid the use of ambiguous and problematically defined genres such as the grotesque, irony, and satire. Roman-era mosaic depicting a scene from Menander's comedy Samia, The Woman from Samos. Starting from 425 BCE, Aristophanes, a comic play and satirical author of the ancient Greek theater, wrote 40 comedies, 11 of which survive. Aristophanes developed his type of comedy from the earlier satyr plays, which were often highly obscene. 11. The only surviving examples of the satyr plays are by Euripides, which are much later examples and not representative of the genre. 12. In ancient Greece, comedy originated in bawdy and ribald songs or recitations apropos of phallic processions and fertility festivals or gatherings. 13. Around 335 BCE, Aristotle, in his work Poetics, stated that comedy originated in phallic processions and the light treatment of the otherwise base and ugly. He also adds that the origins of comedy are obscure because it was not treated seriously from its inception. 14. However, comedy had its own use. Talia, citation needed. Aristotle taught that comedy was generally positive for society, since it brings forth happiness, which for Aristotle was the ideal state, the final goal in any activity. For Aristotle, a comedy did not need to involve sexual humor. A comedy is about the fortunate rise of a sympathetic character. Aristotle divides comedy into 3 categories or subgenres: farce, romantic comedy, and satire. On the other hand, Plato taught that comedy is a destruction to the self. He believed that it produces an emotion that overrides rational self-control and learning. In the Republic, he says that the guardians of the state should avoid laughter, for ordinarily when one abandons himself to violent laughter, his condition provokes a violent reaction. Plato says comedy should be tightly controlled if one wants to achieve the ideal state. Also in Poetics, Aristotle defined comedy as one of the original 4 genres of literature. The other 3 genres are tragedy, epic poetry, and lyric poetry. Literature, in general, is defined by Aristotle as a mimesis, or imitation of life. Comedy is the 3rd form of literature, being the most divorced from a true mimesis. Tragedy is the truest mimesis, followed by epic poetry, comedy, and lyric poetry. The genre of comedy is defined by a certain pattern according to Aristotle's definition. Comedies begin with low or base characters seeking insignificant aims and end with some accomplishment of the aims, which either lightens the initial baseness or reveals the insignificance of the aims. Commedia dell'arte and Shakespearean, Elizabethan comedy. Title page of the first quarto of Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, 1600. Comedy, in its Elizabethan usage, had a very different meaning from modern comedy. A Shakespearean comedy is one that has a happy ending, usually involving marriages between the unmarried characters, and a tone and style that is more light-hearted than Shakespeare's other plays. 15. The Punch and Judy show has roots in the 16th century Italian commedia dell'arte. The figure of Punch derives from the Neapolitan stock character of Pulcinella. 16. The figure who later became Mr. Punch made his first recorded appearance in England in 1662. 17. Punch and Judy are performed in the spirit of outrageous comedy, often provoking shocked laughter, and are dominated by the anarchic clowning of Mr. Punch. 18. Appearing at a significant period in British history, Professor Glyn Edwards states, Pulcinella went down particularly well with Restoration British audiences, fun-starved after years of Puritanism. We soon changed Punch's name, transformed him from a marionette to a hand puppet, and he became, really, a spirit of Britain, a subversive maverick who defies authority, a kind of puppet equivalent to our political cartoons. 17. In early 19th century England, pantomime acquired its present form, which includes slapstick comedy and featured the first mainstream clown Joseph Grimaldi, while comedy routines also feature heavily in British music hall theatre, which became popular in the 1850s. 19. British comedians who honed their skills in music hall sketches include Charlie Chaplin, Stan Laurel, and Dan Leno. 20. English music hall comedian and theatre impresario Fred Karno developed the form of sketch comedy without dialogue in the 1890s, and Chaplin and Laurel were among the comedians who worked for his company. 20. Karno was a pioneer of slapstick, and in his biography, Laurel stated, Fred Karno didn't teach Charlie, Chaplin, and me all we know about comedy. He just taught us most of it. 21. Film producer Hal Roach stated, Fred Karno is not only a genius, he is the man who originated slapstick comedy. We in Hollywood owe much to him. 22. American vaudeville emerged in the 1880s and remained popular until the 1930s, and featured comedians such as W. C. Fields, Buster Keaton, and the Marx Brothers. 20th century theater and art. See also, surreal humor, theater of the absurd, and absurdist fiction. Surreal humor, also known as absurdist humor or surreal comedy, is a form of humor predicated on deliberate violations of causal reasoning, producing events and behaviors that are obviously illogical. Constructions of surreal humor tend to involve bizarre juxtapositions, incongruity, non sequiturs, irrational or absurd situations, and expressions of nonsense. 23. The humor arises from a subversion of audiences' expectations, so that amusement is founded on unpredictability, separate from a logical analysis of the situation. The humor derived gets its appeal from the ridiculousness and unlikeliness of the situation. The genre has roots in surrealism in the arts. 23. Edward Lear, aged 73 and a half, and his Tat Foss, aged 16, an 1885 lithograph by Edward Lear. Surreal humor is the effect of illogic and absurdity being used for humorous effect. Under such premises, people can identify precursors and early examples of surreal humor at least since the 19th century, such as Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, which both use illogic and absurdity, hookah-smoking caterpillars, croquet matches using live flamingos as mallets, etc., for humorous effect. Many of Edward Lear's children's stories and poems contain nonsense and are basically surreal in approach. For example, the story of the four little children who went round the world, 1871, is filled with contradictory statements and odd images intended to provoke amusement, such as the following. After a time they saw some land at a distance, and when they came to it, They found it was an island made of water quite surrounded by earth. Besides that, it was bordered by evanescent isthmuses with a great Gulf Stream running about all over it, so that it was perfectly beautiful and contained only a single tree, 503 feet high, 24. In the early 20th century, several avant-garde movements, including the Dadaists, Surrealists, and Futurists, began to argue for an art that was random, jarring and illogical. 25. The goals of these movements were in some sense serious, and they were committed to undermining the solemnity and self-satisfaction of the contemporary artistic establishment. As a result, much of their art was intentionally amusing. A famous example is Marcel Duchamp's fountain, 1917, an inverted urinal signed a mutt. This became one of the most famous and influential pieces of art in history, and one of the earliest examples of the found object movement. D is also a joke, relying on the inversion of the item's function as expressed by its title as well as its incongruous presence in an art exhibition. The advent of cinema in the late 19th century, and later radio and television in the 20th century broadened the access of comedians to the general public. Charlie Chaplin, through silent film, became one of the best-known faces on earth. The silent tradition lived on well into the late 20th century through mime artists like Marcel Marceau, and the slapstick comedy of artists like Rowan Atkinson, as Mr. Bean. The tradition of the circus clown also continued, with such as Bozo the Clown in the United States and Oleg Popov in Russia. Radio provided new possibilities, with Britain producing the influential surreal humor of the Goon Show after the Second World War. The Goons' influence spread to the American radio and recording troupe the Firesign Theater. American cinema has produced a great number of globally renowned comedy artists, from Laurel and Hardy, the Three Stooges, Abbott and Costello, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, Bob Hope and Phyllis Diller during the mid-20th century, to performers like George Carlin, Bill Cosby, Joan Rivers, Robin Williams, and Eddie Murphy toward the end of the century. Hollywood attracted many international talents like the British comics Peter Sellers, Dudley Moore and Sacha Baron Cohen, Canadian comics Dan Aykroyd, Jim Carrey, and Mike Myers, and the Australian comedian Paul Hogan, famous for Crocodile Dundee. Other centers of creative comic activity have been the cinema of Hong Kong, Bollywood, and French farce. American television has also been an influential force in world comedy, with American series like M*A*S*S*H, Seinfeld, and The Simpsons achieving large followings around the world. British television comedy also remains influential, with quintessential works including Fawlty Towers, Monty Python, Dad's Army, Blackadder, and The Office. Australian satirist Barry Humphries, whose comic creations include The Housewife and Jidaster, Dame Edna Everage, for his delivery of Dadaist and absurdist humor to millions, was described by biographer Ann Pender in 2010 as not only the most significant theatrical figure of our time, but the most significant comedian to emerge since Charlie Chaplin. 27. The phenomena connected with laughter and that which provokes it have been carefully investigated by psychologists. They agree the predominant characteristics are incongruity or contrast in the object and shock or emotional seizure on the part of the subject. It has also been held that the feeling of superiority is an essential factor, thus Thomas Hobbes speaks of laughter as a sudden glory. Modern investigators have paid much attention to the origin both of laughter and of smiling, as well as the development of the play instinct and its emotional expression. George Meredith said that, one excellent test of the civilization of a country I take to be the flourishing of the comic idea in comedy, and the test of true comedy is that it shall awaken thoughtful laughter. Laughter is said to be the cure for being sick. Studies show that people who laugh more often get sick less. 29:30. American literary theorist Kenneth Burke writes that the comic frame in rhetoric is neither wholly euphemistic nor wholly debunking, hence it provides the charitable attitude towards people that is required for purposes of persuasion and cooperation, but at the same time maintains our shrewdness concerning the simplicities of cashing it. 31. The purpose of the comic frame is to satirize a given circumstance and promote change by doing so. The comic frame makes fun of situations and people, while simultaneously provoking thought. 32. The comic frame does not aim to vilify in its analysis, but rather, rebuke the stupidity and foolery of those involved in the circumstances. 33. For example, on The Daily Show, Jon Stewart uses the comic frame to intervene in political arguments, often offering crude humor in sudden contrast to serious news. In a segment on President Obama's trip to China, Stewart remarks on America's debt to the Chinese government while also having a weak relationship with the country. After depicting this dismal situation, Stewart shifts to speak directly to President Obama, calling upon him to shine that turd up. 34. For Stewart and his audience, introducing coarse language into what is otherwise a serious commentary on the state of foreign relations serves to frame the segment comically, creating a serious tone underlying the comedic agenda presented by Stewart. Comedy may be divided into multiple genres based on the source of humor, the method of delivery, and the context in which it is delivered. The different forms of comedy often overlap, and most comedy can fit into multiple genres. Some of the subgenres of comedy are farce, comedy of manners, burlesque, and satire. Some comedy apes certain cultural forms. For instance, parody and satire often imitate the conventions of the genre they are parodying or satirizing. For example, in the United States, parodies of newspapers and television news include The Onion and The Colbert Report. In Australia, shows such as Kath and Kim, Utopia, and Sean McAuliffe's Mad as Hell perform the same role. Self-deprecation is a technique of comedy used by many comedians who focus on their misfortunes and foibles in order to entertain. Thriller is a genre of fiction with numerous, often overlapping, subgenres, including crime, horror, and detective fiction. Thrillers are characterized and defined by the moods they elicit, giving their audiences heightened feelings of suspense, excitement, surprise, anticipation, and anxiety. 1. This genre is well suited to film and television. A thriller generally keeps its audience on the edge of their seats as the plot builds towards a climax. The cover-up of important information is a common element. 2. Literary devices such as red herrings, plot twists, unreliable narrators, and cliffhangers are used extensively. A thriller is often a villain-driven plot, whereby they present obstacles that the protagonist or hero must overcome. Roots of the genre date back hundreds of years, but it began to develop as a distinct style in the 19th century and the early 20th century with novels like The Count of Monte Cristo, 1848, and The 39 Steps, 1915. The films of Alfred Hitchcock are critical in the development of the thriller film during the mid-20th century. 3. Some popular 21st century mainstream examples include The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, Gone Girl, The Girl on the Train, The Woman in the Window, and the British television series Utopia. Characteristics. Writer Vladimir Nabokov, in his lectures at Cornell University, said, "In an Anglo-Saxon thriller, the villain is generally punished, and the strong silent man generally wins the weak babbling girl, but there is no governmental law in Western countries to ban a story that does not comply with a fond tradition, so that we always hope that the wicked but romantic fellow will escape scot-free and the good but dull chap will be finally snubbed by the moody heroine." 4. Thrillers may be defined by the primary mood that they elicit, suspenseful excitement. In short, if it thrills, it is a thriller. As the introduction to a major anthology says, thrillers provide such a rich literary feast. There are all kinds. The legal thriller, spy thriller, action-adventure thriller, medical thriller, police thriller, romantic thriller, historical thriller, political thriller, religious thriller, high-tech thriller, military thriller. The list goes on, with new variations constantly being invented. In fact, this openness to expansion is one of the genre's most enduring characteristics. But what gives the variety of thrillers a common ground is the intensity of emotions they create, particularly those of apprehension and exhilaration, of excitement and breathlessness, all designed to generate that all-important thrill. By definition, if a thriller doesn't thrill, it's not doing its job. James Patterson, June 2006, Introduction, Thriller, 5. Suspense. Suspense is a crucial characteristic of the thriller genre. It gives the viewer a feeling of pleasurable fascination and excitement mixed with apprehension, anticipation, and tension. These develop from unpredictable, mysterious, and rousing events during the narrative, which makes the viewer or reader think about the outcome of certain actions. Suspense builds in order to make those final moments, no matter how short, the most memorable. The suspense in a story keeps the person hooked to reading or watching more until the climax is reached. Common methods and themes in crime and action thrillers are ransoms, captivities, heists, revenge, and kidnappings. Common in mystery thrillers are investigations and the whodunit technique. Common elements in dramatic and psychological thrillers include plot twists, psychology, obsession, and mind games. Common elements of science fiction thrillers are killing robots, machines, or aliens, mad scientists, and experiments. Common in horror thrillers are serial killers, stalking, death traps, and horror of personality. Elements such as fringe theories, false accusations, and paranoia are common in paranoid thrillers. Threats to entire countries, spies, espionage, conspiracies, assassins, and electronic surveillance are common in spy thrillers. 9. Characters may include criminals, stalkers, assassins, innocent victims, often on the run, menaced women, psychotic individuals, spree killers, sociopaths, agents, terrorists, police, escaped convicts, private eyes, people involved in twisted relationships, world-weary men and women, psycho-fiends, and more. The themes frequently include terrorism, political conspiracy, pursuit, or romantic triangles leading to murder. Plots of thrillers involve characters which come into conflict with each other or with outside forces. 10. The protagonist of these films is set against a problem. No matter what subgenre a thriller film falls into, it will emphasize the danger that the protagonist faces. The protagonists are frequently ordinary citizens unaccustomed to danger, although commonly in crime and action thrillers, they may also be hard men accustomed to danger such as police officers and detectives. While protagonists of thrillers have traditionally been men, women lead characters are increasingly common. 11. In psychological thrillers, the protagonists are reliant on their mental resources, whether it be by battling wits with the antagonist or by battling for equilibrium in the character's own mind. The suspense often comes from two or more characters preying upon one another's minds, either by playing deceptive games with the other or by nearly trying to demolish the other's mental state. 11. Story and setting. An atmosphere of menace and sudden violence, such as crime and murder, characterize thrillers. The tension usually arises when the characters is placed in a dangerous situation, or a trap from which escaping seems impossible. Life is threatened, usually because the principal character is unsuspectingly or unknowingly involved in a dangerous or potentially deadly situation. 12. Hitchcock's films often placed an innocent victim, an average, responsible person, into a strange, life-threatening or terrorizing situation, in a case of mistaken identity or wrongful accusation. 13. Thrillers take place mostly in ordinary suburbs and cities, citation needed, although sometimes they may take place wholly or partly in exotic settings such as foreign cities, deserts, polar regions, or the high seas. These usually tough, resourceful, but essentially ordinary heroes are pitted against villains determined to destroy them, their country, or the stability of the free world, especially if it is set during the Cold War. Often in a thriller movie, the protagonist is faced with what seem to be insurmountable problems in his mission, carried out against a ticking clock. The stakes are high, and although resourceful, they face personal dilemmas along the way, forcing them to make sacrifices for others. Citation needed. History in literature. Ancient epic poems such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, Homer's Odyssey, and the Mahabharata may have used similar narrative techniques to modern thrillers. Citation needed. The Three Apples, A Tale in the 1001 Nights, Arabian Nights, is a murder mystery. 14, with multiple plot twists. 15, and detective fiction elements. 16, in this tale, a fisherman discovers a heavy, locked chest on the banks of the Tigris River and sells it to the Abbasid Caliph, Harun al-Rashid, who has it broken open, only to discover inside it the dismembered body of a young woman. Harun then orders his vizier, Jafar ibn Yahya, to solve the crime and find the murderer within 3 days. This whodunit mystery has also been considered a detective story, though it lacks a sleuth. 14, 17. The Count of Monte Cristo, 1844, is a swashbuckling revenge thriller about a man named Edmond Dantes who is betrayed by his friends and sent to languish in the notorious Château d'If. His only companion is an old man who teaches him everything from philosophy to mathematics to swordplay. Just before the old man dies, he reveals to Dantes the secret location of a great treasure. Shortly after, Dantes engineers a daring escape and uses the treasure to reinvent himself as the Count of Monte Cristo. Thirsting for vengeance, he sets out to punish those who destroyed his life. The first recognizable modern thriller was Erskine Childers' The Riddle of the Sands, 1903, in which 2 young Englishmen stumble upon a secret German armada preparing to invade their homeland. The 39 Steps, 1915, is an early detective thriller by John Buchan, in which an innocent man becomes the prime suspect in a murder case and finds himself on the run from both the police and enemy spies. Fritz Lang's Dem, 1931, is regarded as a groundbreaking psychological thriller, introducing innovative suspense-enhancing audiovisual techniques that have become standard and ubiquitous ever since. Gillis, 1936, is an early example of a political thriller, and in one of the book's subplots the protagonist Gillis Gamber finds himself embroiled in a left-wing assassination plot against the Prime Minister. The plot falls apart due to the ineptness of the conspirators, and Gillis ends with the protagonist leaving to fight in the Spanish Civil War. The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, 1963, by John le Carré is set in the world of Cold War espionage and helped to usher in an era of thriller fiction based around professional spies and the battle of wits between rival spymasters. There have been at least 2 television series called simply Thriller, one made in the US in the 1960s and one made in the UK in the 1970s. Although in no way linked, both series consisted of one-off dramas, each utilizing the familiar motifs of the genre. The Twilight Zone consists of suspenseful unrelated dramas depicting characters dealing with paranormal, futuristic, supernatural, or otherwise disturbing or unusual events. Characters who find themselves dealing with these strange, sometimes inexplicable happenings are said to have crossed over into the Twilight Zone. Each story typically features a moral and a surprise ending. Literature is any collection of written work, but it is also used more narrowly for writing specifically considered to be an art form, especially novels, plays, and poems. 1. It includes both print and digital writing. 2. In recent centuries, the definition has expanded to include oral literature, much of which has been transcribed. 3. 4. Literature is a method of recording, preserving, and transmitting knowledge and entertainment. It can also have a social, psychological, spiritual, or political role. Literary criticism is one of the oldest academic disciplines, and is concerned with the literary merit or intellectual significance of specific texts. The study of books and other texts as artifacts or traditions is instead encompassed by textual criticism or the history of the book. Literature, as an art form, is sometimes used synonymously with literary fiction, fiction written with the goal of artistic merit. 5, 6, but can also include works in various non-fiction genres, such as biography, diaries, memoirs, letters, and essays. Within this broader definition, literature includes non-fictional books, articles, or other written information on a particular subject. 7, 8. Developments in print technology have allowed an ever-growing distribution and proliferation of written works, while the digital era has blurred the lines between online electronic literature and other forms of modern media. Definitions of literature have varied over time. 9. In Western Europe, prior to the 18th century, literature denoted all books and writing. It can be seen as returning to older, more inclusive notions, so that cultural studies, for instance, include, in addition to canonical works, popular and minority genres. The word is also used in reference to non-written works, to oral literature, and the literature of pre-literate culture. Citation needed. Etymologically, the term derives from Latin literatura/literatura, learning, writing, grammar, originally, writing formed with letters, from litera/litera, letter. 10. In spite of this, the term has also been applied to spoken or sung texts. 11. 12. Literature is often referred to synecdochically as writing, especially creative writing, and poetically as the craft of writing, or simply the craft. Sid Field described his discipline, screenwriting, as a craft that occasionally rises to the level of art. 13. A value judgment definition of literature considers it as consisting solely of high-quality writing that forms part of the belles lettres, fine writing, tradition. 14. An example of this is in the 1910 to 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica, which classified literature as the best expression of the best. Reduced to writing. A traditional Kyrgyz monasty performing part of the Epic of Manas at a yurt camp in Karakol, Kyrgyzstan. The use of the term literature here poses some issues due to its origins in the Latin litera, letter, essentially writing. Alternatives such as oral forms and oral genres have been suggested, but the word literature is widely used. Australian Aboriginal culture has thrived on oral traditions and oral histories passed down through tens of thousands of years. In a study published in February 2020, new evidence showed that both Budge Bam and Tower Hill volcanoes erupted between 34,000 and 40,000 years ago. 16. Significantly, this is a minimum age constraint for human presence in Victoria, and also could be interpreted as evidence for the oral histories of the Gunditjmara people, an Aboriginal Australian people of southwestern Victoria, which tell of volcanic eruptions being some of the oldest oral traditions in existence. 17. An axe found underneath volcanic ash in 1947 had already proven that humans inhabited the region before the eruption of Tower Hill. 16. Oral literature is an ancient human tradition found in all corners of the world. 18. Modern archaeology has been unveiling evidence of the human efforts to preserve and transmit arts and knowledge that depended completely or partially on an oral tradition across various cultures. The Judeo-Christian Bible reveals its oral traditional roots. Medieval European manuscripts are penned by performing scribes. Geometric vases from archaic Greece mirror Homer's oral style. Indeed, if these final decades of the millennium have taught us anything, it must be that oral tradition never was the other we accused it of being. It never was the primitive, preliminary technology of communication we thought it to be. Rather, if the whole truth is told, oral tradition stands out as the single most dominant communicative technology of our species as both a historical fact and, in many areas still, a contemporary reality. 18. The earliest poetry is believed to have been recited or sung, employed as a way of remembering history, genealogy, and law. 19. In Asia, the transmission of folklore, mythologies as well as scriptures in ancient India, in different Indian religions, was by oral tradition, preserved with precision with the help of elaborate mnemonic techniques. 20. The early Buddhist texts are also generally believed to be of oral tradition, with the first by comparing inconsistencies in the transmitted versions of literature from various oral societies such as the Greek, Serbia and other cultures, then noting that the Vedic literature is too consistent and vast to have been composed and transmitted orally across generations, without being written down. 21. According to Goody, the Vedic texts likely involved both a written and oral tradition, calling it a parallel products of a literate society. 22. All ancient Greek literature was to some degree oral in nature, and the earliest literature was completely so. 23. Homer's epic poetry, states Michael Gagarin, was largely composed, performed, and transmitted orally. 24. As folklores and legends were performed in front of distant audiences, the singers would substitute the names in the stories with local characters or rulers to give the stories a local flavor and thus connect with the audience by making the historicity embedded in the oral tradition as unreliable. 25. The lack of surviving texts about the Greek and Roman religious traditions have led scholars to presume that these were ritualistic and transmitted as oral traditions, but some scholars disagree that the complex rituals in the ancient Greek and Roman civilizations were an exclusive product of an oral tradition. 26. Writing systems are not known to have existed among native North Americans, north of Mesoamerica, before contact with Europeans. Oral storytelling traditions flourished in a context without the use of writing to record and preserve history, scientific knowledge, and social practices. 27. While some stories were told for amusement and leisure, most functioned as practical lessons from tribal experience applied to immediate moral, social, psychological, and environmental issues. 28. Stories fuse fictional, supernatural, or otherwise exaggerated characters and circumstances with real emotions and morals as a means of teaching. Plots often reflect real-life situations and may be aimed at particular people known by the story's audience. In this way, social pressure could be exerted without directly causing embarrassment or social exclusion. 29. For example, rather than yelling, Inuit parents might deter their children from wandering too close to the water's edge by telling a story about a sea monster with a pouch for children within its reach. The enduring significance of oral traditions is underscored in a systemic literature review on indigenous languages in South Africa, within the framework of contemporary linguistic challenges. Oral literature is crucial for cultural preservation, linguistic diversity, and social justice, as evidenced by the post-colonial struggles and ongoing initiatives to safeguard and promote South African indigenous languages. Oratory, or the art of public speaking, was considered a literary art for a significant period of time. 7. From ancient Greece to the late 19th century, rhetoric played a central role in Western education in training orators, lawyers, counselors, historians, statesmen, and poets. Limestone Kish tablet from Sumer with pictographic writing may be the earliest known writing, 3500 BC. Ashmolean Museum. Around the 4th millennium BC, the complexity of trade and administration in Mesopotamia outgrew human memory, and writing became a more dependable method of recording and presenting transactions in a permanent form. 34. Though in both ancient Egypt and Mesoamerica, writing may have already emerged because of the need to record historical and environmental events. Subsequent innovations included more uniform, predictable legal systems, sacred texts, and the origins of modern practices of scientific inquiry and knowledge consolidation, all largely reliant on portable and easily reproducible forms of writing. Early written literature. Main articles: History of Literature, Ancient Literature, and History of Books. Ancient Egyptian literature, 35, along with Sumerian literature, are considered the world's oldest literatures. 36. The primary genres of the literature of ancient Egypt, didactic texts, hymns and prayers, and tales, were written almost entirely in verse. Wink with a frown. 37. By the Old Kingdom, 26th century BC to 22nd century BC, literary works included funerary texts, epistles and letters, hymns and poems, and commemorative autobiographical texts recounting the careers of prominent administrative officials. It was not until the early Middle Kingdom, 21st century BC to 17th century BC, that a narrative Egyptian literature was created. Many works of early periods, even in narrative form, had a covert moral or didactic purpose, such as the Sanskrit Panchatantra, 200 BC, 300 AD, based on older oral tradition. 39, 40. Drama and satire also developed as urban cultures, which provided a larger public audience, and later readership for literary production. Lyric poetry, as opposed to epic poetry, was often the speciality of courts and aristocratic circles, particularly in East Asia, where songs were collected by the Chinese aristocracy as poems, the most notable being the Shijing or Book of Songs, 1046 c. 600 BC. Inscribed hieroglyphics cover an obelisk in foreground. A stone statue is in background. Egyptian hieroglyphs with cartouches for the name, Ramesses II, from the Luxor Temple, New Kingdom. In ancient China, early literature was primarily focused on philosophy, historiography, military science, agriculture, and poetry. China, the origin of modern paper making and woodblock printing, produced the world's first print cultures. 44. Much of Chinese literature originates with the Hundred Schools of Thought period that occurred during the Eastern Zhou dynasty, 769–69 BC. 45. The most important of these include the classics of Confucianism, of Taoism, of Moism, of legalism, as well as works of military science, e.g. Sun Tzu's The Art of War, c. 5th century BC, and Chinese history, e.g. Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian, c. 94 BC. Ancient Chinese literature had a heavy emphasis on historiography, with often very detailed court records. An exemplary piece of narrative history of ancient China was the Suozhuan, which was compiled no later than 389 BC, and attributed to the blind 5th century BC historian Zhuo Qiumen, 46. In ancient India, literature originated from stories that were originally orally transmitted. Early genres included drama, fables, sutras, and epic poetry. Sanskrit literature begins with the Vedas, dating back to 1500 to 1000 BC, and continues with the Sanskrit epics of Iron Age India. The Vedas are among the oldest sacred texts. The Samhitas, Vedic collections, date to roughly 1500 to 1000 BC, and the Circumvedic texts, as well as the redaction of the Samhitas, date to c. 1500 BC, resulting in a Vedic period, spanning the mid-2nd to mid-1st millennium BC, or the Late Bronze Age and the Iron Age, 49. The period between approximately the 6th to 1st centuries BC saw the composition and redaction of the two most influential Indian epics, the Mahabharata, 50-51, and the Ramayana, 52, with subsequent redaction. Progressing down to the 4th century AD, such as Rankaritmanas. The earliest known Greek writings are Mycenaean, circa 1600 to 1100 BC, written in the linear B-syllabary on clay tablets. These documents contain prosaic records largely concerned with trade, lists, inventories, receipts, etc. No real literature has been discovered. 54-55, Michael Ventris and John Chadwick, the original decipherers of Linear B, state that literature almost certainly existed in Mycenaean Greece, 55, but it was either not written down or, if it was on parchment or wooden tablets, which did not survive the destruction of the Mycenaean palaces in the 12th century BC, 55, Homer's epic. Poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are central works of ancient Greek literature. It is generally accepted that the poems were composed at some point around the late 8th or early 7th century BC, 56. Modern scholars consider these accounts legendary, 57, 58, 59. Most researchers believe that the poems were originally transmitted orally, 60, from antiquity until the present day. The influence of Homeric epic on Western civilization has been significant, inspiring many of its most famous works of literature, music, art, and film. 61. The Homeric epics were the greatest influence on ancient Greek culture and education. To Plato, Homer was simply the one who has taught Greece. 10. Heleta Pepidoukan, 62, 63. Hesiod's works and days, c. 700 BC, and Theogony are some of the earliest and most influential works of ancient Greek literature. Classical Greek genres included philosophy, poetry, historiography, comedies, and dramas. Plato, 428/427 or 424/423, 348/347 BC, and Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC, authored philosophical texts that are regarded as the foundation of Western philosophy. Sappho, c. 630, c. 570 BC, and Pindar were influential lyric poets, and Herodotus, c. 484, c. 425 BC, and Thucydides were early Greek historians. Although drama was popular in ancient Greece, of the hundreds of tragedies written and performed during the classical age, only a limited number of plays by three authors still exist: Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. The plays of Aristophanes, c. 446, c. 386 BC, provide the only real examples of a genre of comic drama known as Old Comedy, the earliest form of Greek comedy, and are in fact used to define the genre. 64. The Hebrew religious text, the Torah, is widely seen as a product of the Persian period, 539 to 333 BC, probably 450 to 350 BC. 65. This consensus echoes a traditional Jewish view which gives Ezra, the leader of the Jewish community on its return from Babylon, a pivotal role in its promulgation. 66. This represents a major source of Christianity's Bible, which has had a major influence on Western literature. 67. The beginning of Roman literature dates to 240 BC, when a Roman audience saw a Latin version of a Greek play. 68. Literature in Latin would flourish for the next 6 centuries, and includes essays, histories, poems, plays, and other writings. The Quran, 610 AD to 632 AD, 69, the main holy book of Islam, had a significant influence on the Arab language and marked the beginning of Islamic literature. Muslims believe it was transcribed in the Arabic dialect of the Quraysh, the tribe of Muhammad. 29, 70. As Islam spread, the Quran had the effect of unifying and standardizing Arabic. 29. Theological works in Latin were the dominant form of literature in Europe, typically found in libraries during the Middle Ages. Western vernacular literature includes the poetic Edda and the sagas, or heroic epics, of Iceland, the Anglo-Saxon Beowulf, and the German Song of Hildebrand. A later form of medieval fiction was the romance, an adventurous and sometimes magical narrative with strong popular appeal. 71. Controversial, religious, political, and instructional literature proliferated during the European Renaissance as a result of the Johannes Gutenberg's invention of the printing press. 72. Around 1440, while the medieval romance developed into the novel. 73. The intricate frontispiece of the Diamond Sutra from Tang Dynasty China, the world's earliest dated printed book. 8868, British Library. Publishing became possible with the invention of writing but became more practical with the invention of printing. Prior to printing, distributed works were copied manually by scribes. The Chinese inventor Bai Xing made movable type of earthenware c. 1045 and was spread to Korea later. Around 1230, Koreans invented a metal type movable printing. East metal movable type was spread to Europe between the late 14th century and early 15th century. 74, 75, 76, 77. In c. 1450, Johannes Gutenberg invented movable type in Europe. This invention gradually made books less expensive to produce and more widely available. Early printed books, single sheets, and images created before 1501 in Europe are known as incunables or incunabula. A man born in 1453, the year of the fall of Constantinople, could look back from his 50th year on a lifetime in which about 8 million books had been printed, more perhaps than all the scribes of Europe had produced since Constantine founded his city in AD 330. 78. Eventually, printing enabled other forms of publishing besides books. The history of newspaper publishing began in Germany in 1609, with the publishing of magazines following in 1663. University discipline. In England. Main article, English Studies. In late 1820s England, growing political and social awareness, particularly among the utilitarians and Benthamites, promoted the possibility of including courses in English literary study in the newly formed London University. This further developed into the idea of the study of literature being the ideal carrier for the propagation of the humanist cultural myth of a well-educated, culturally harmonious nation. 79. America. Main article, American Literature, Academic Discipline. Women and Literature. Further information, French literature, German literature, Russian literature, and English poetry section. Women poets in the 18th century. The widespread education of women was not common until the 19th century, and because of this, literature until recently was mostly male-dominated. Deity. George Sand was an idea. She has a unique place in our age. Others are great men, she was a great woman. Victor Hugo, Les Funérailles de George Sand, 81. There were few English-language women poets whose names are remembered until the 20th century. In the 19th century, some notable individuals include Emily Bronte, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and Emily Dickinson. See American poetry. But while generally women are absent from the European canon of romantic literature, there is one notable exception: the French novelist and memoirist Amandine Dupin, 1804 to 1876, best known by her pen name George Sand, 82-83, one of the more popular writers in Europe in her lifetime, 84. Being more renowned than both Victor Hugo and Honoré de Balzac in England in the 1830s and 1840s, 85, Sand is recognized as one of the most notable writers of the European Romantic era. Jane Austen, 1775 to 1817, is the first major English woman novelist, while Aphra Behn is an early female dramatist. Nobel Prizes in Literature have been awarded between 1901 and 2020 to 117 individuals, 101 men and 16 women. Selma Lagerlöf, 1858 to 1940, was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in Literature, which she was awarded in 1909. Additionally, she was the first woman to be granted a membership in the Swedish Academy in 1914. 86. Feminist scholars have since the 20th century sought to expand the literary canon to include more women writers. Children's literature. The Adventures of Pinocchio, 1883, is a canonical piece of children's literature and one of the best-selling books ever published, 87. A separate genre of children's literature only began to emerge in the 18th century, with the development of the concept of childhood, 88. The earliest of these books were educational books, books on conduct, and simple ABCs, often decorated with animals, plants, and anthropomorphic letters, 89. Study and criticism. Main article, Literary Criticism. Icon. This section needs expansion. You can help by adding to it. November 2024. Literary Theory. Further information, Literary Theory and Philosophy and Literature section. The Philosophy of Literature. A fundamental question of literary theory is, what is literature? Although many contemporary theorists and literary scholars believe either that literature cannot be defined or that it can refer to any use of language, 90. Literary fiction. Further information, Western Canon section. Literary canon. Dante, Homer, and Virgil in Raphael's Parnassus fresco, 1511, key figures in the Western canon. Literary fiction is a term used to describe fiction that explores any facet of the human condition and may involve social commentary. It is often regarded as having more artistic merit than genre fiction, especially the most commercially oriented types, but this has been contested in recent years, with the serious study of genre fiction within universities, 91. The following, by the British author William Boyd on the short story, might be applied to all prose fiction. Short stories seem to answer something very deep in our nature, as if, for the duration of its telling, something special has been created, some essence of our experience extrapolated, some temporary sense has been made of our common, turbulent journey towards the grave and oblivion, 92. The very best in literature is annually recognized by the Nobel Prize in Literature, which is awarded to an author from any country who has, in the words of the will of Swedish industrialist Alfred Nobel, produced, in the field of literature, the most outstanding work in an ideal direction. Original Swedish, Den som inom litteraturen har producerat det mest framstående I en idealisk riktning. Doc. 93, 94. The value of imaginative literature. Some researchers suggest that literary fiction can play a role in an individual's psychological development. 95. Psychologists have also been using literature as a therapeutic tool. 96. 97. Psychologist Hogan argues for the value of the time and emotion that a person devotes to understanding a character's situation in literature. Wink with a frown. 98. That it can unite a large community by provoking universal emotions, as well as allowing readers access to different cultures and new emotional experiences. 99. One study, for example, suggested that the presence of familiar cultural values in literary texts played an important impact on the performance of minority students. 100. Psychologist Maslow's ideas help literary critics understand how characters in literature reflect their personal culture and the history. 101. The theory suggests that literature helps an individual struggle for self-fulfillment. 102. 103. Aesthetic value. Further information, aesthetic judgment and value judgment. The influence of religious texts. Further information, Islamic literature and King James Version section influence. Religion has had a major influence on literature through works like the Vedas, the Torah, the Bible, 104, and the Quran, 105, 106, 107. The King James Version of the Bible has been called the most influential version of the most influential book in the world, in what is now its most influential language, the most important book in English religion and culture, and, arguably, the most celebrated book in the English-speaking world. 108, principally because of its literary style and widespread distribution. Prominent atheist figures such as the late Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins have praised the King James Version as being a giant step in the maturing of English literature and a great work of literature, respectively, with Dawkins adding, "A native speaker of English who has never read a word of the King James Bible is verging on the barbarian." 109, 110. Societies in which preaching has great importance, and those in which religious structures and authorities have a near monopoly of reading and writing and/or a censorship role, as, for example, in the European Middle Ages, may impart a religious gloss, clarification needed, to much of the literature those societies produce or retain. The traditions of close study of religious texts has furthered the development of techniques and theories in literary studies. Citation needed. Types. Poetry. A calligram by Dio Mapollinea. These are a type of poem in which the written words are arranged in such a way to produce a visual image. Main article, Poetry. Poetry has traditionally been distinguished from prose by its greater use of the aesthetic qualities of language, including musical devices such as assonance, alliteration, rhyme, and rhythm, and by being said in lines and verses rather than paragraphs, and more recently its use of other typographical elements. 111, 112, 113. This distinction is complicated by various hybrid forms such as digital poetry, sound poetry, concrete poetry, and prose poem. 114, and more generally by the fact that prose possesses rhythm. 115, Abram Lipsky refers to it as an open secret that prose is not distinguished from poetry by lack of rhythm. 116. Prior to the 19th century, poetry was commonly understood to be something set in metrical lines, any kind of subject consisting of rhythm or verses. 111, possibly as a result of Aristotle's influence, his Poetics. Poetry, before the 19th century, was usually less a technical designation for verse than a nominative category of fictive or rhetorical art. Clarification needed. 117. As a form it may predate literacy, with the earliest works being composed within and sustained by an oral tradition. Wink with a frown. 118, 119. Hence it constitutes the earliest example of literature. Prose. Main article, prose. As noted above, prose generally makes far less use of the aesthetic qualities of language than poetry, 112, 113, 120. However, developments in modern literature, including free verse and prose poetry, have tended to blur the differences, and poet T.S. Eliot suggested that while the distinction between verse and prose is clear, the distinction between poetry and prose is obscure. 121. There are verse novels, a type of narrative poetry in which a novel-length narrative is told through the medium of poetry rather than prose. Eugene Onegin, 1831, by Alexander Pushkin is the most famous example. 122. On the historical development of prose, Richard Graff notes that, in the case of ancient Greece, recent scholarship has emphasized the fact that formal prose was a comparatively late development, and convention, properly associated with the classical period. 123. Latin was a major influence on the development of prose in many European countries. Especially important was the great Roman orator Cicero. 124. It was the lingua franca among literate Europeans until quite recent times, and the great works of Descartes, 1596–1650, Francis Bacon, 1561–1626, and Baruch Spinoza, 1632–1677, were published in Latin. Among the last important books written primarily in Latin prose were the works of Swedenborg, died in 1772, Linnaeus, died in 1778, Euler, died in 1783, Gauss, died in 1855, and Isaac Newton, died in 1727. A novel is a long fictional narrative, usually written in prose. In English, the term emerged from the Romance languages in the late 15th century, with the meaning of news. It came to indicate something new, without a distinction between fact or fiction. 125. The Romance is a closely related long prose narrative. Walter Scott defined it as a fictitious narrative in prose or verse, the interest of which turns upon marvelous and uncommon incidents, whereas in the novel, the events are accommodated to the ordinary train of human events and the modern state of society. 126. Other European languages do not distinguish between romance and novel. A novel is Low Roman, Der Roman, Illinois Romanzo, 127, indicates the proximity of the forms. Although there are many historical prototypes, so-called novels before the novel, 129, the modern novel form emerges late in cultural history, roughly during the 18th century. 130, initially subject to much criticism, the novel has acquired a dominant position amongst literary forms, both popularly and critically. Novella. Main article, novella. The publisher Melville House classifies the novella as too short to be a novel, too long to be a short story. 133. Publishers and literary award societies typically consider a novella to be between 17,000 and 40,000 words. Short story. Main article, short story. A dilemma in defining the short story as a literary form is how to, or whether one should, distinguish it from any short narrative and its contested origin. 135, then include the Bible and Edgar Allan Poe. Graphic novel. Main article, graphic novel. Graphic novels and comic books present stories told in a combination of artwork, dialogue, and text. Electronic literature. Electronic literature is a literary genre consisting of works created exclusively on and for digital devices. Nonfiction. Common literary examples of nonfiction include the essay, travel literature, biography, autobiography and memoir, journalism, letter, diary, history, philosophy, economics, scientific, nature, and technical writings, 8, 137. Nonfiction can fall within the broad category of literature as any collection of written work, but some works fall within the narrower definition by virtue of the excellence of their writing, their originality, and their general aesthetic and artistic merits. 138. Drama. Cover of a 1921 libretto for Giordano's opera Andrea Xenia. Drama is literature intended for performance. 139. The form is combined with music and dance in opera and musical theater. See libretto. A play is a written dramatic work by a playwright that is intended for performance in a theater. It comprises chiefly dialogue between characters. A classic drama, by contrast, is written to be read rather than to be performed, the meaning of which can be realized fully on the page. 140. Nearly all drama took verse form until comparatively recently. The earliest form of which there exists substantial knowledge is Greek drama. This developed as a performance associated with religious and civic festivals, typically enacting or developing upon well-known historical or mythological themes. In the 20th century, scripts written for non-stage media have been added to this form, including radio, television, and film. Law and literature. The law and literature movement focuses on the interdisciplinary connection between law and literature. Copyright. Further information, History of copyright. Copyright is a type of intellectual property that gives its owner the exclusive right to make copies of a creative work, usually for a limited time. The creative work may be in a literary, artistic, educational, or musical form. Copyright is intended to protect the original expression of an idea in the form of a creative work, but not the idea itself. 146, 147, 148. United Kingdom. Literary works have been protected by copyright law from unauthorized reproduction since at least 1710. 149. Literary works are defined by copyright law to mean any work, other than a dramatic or musical work, which is written, spoken, or sung, and accordingly includes a table or compilation, other than a database, b. a computer program, c. preparatory design material for a computer program, and d. a database. 150. Literary works are all works of literature, that is, all works expressed in print or writing, other than dramatic or musical works. 151. United States. The copyright law of the United States has a long and complicated history, dating back to colonial times. It was established as federal law with the Copyright Act of 1790. This act was updated many times, including a major revision in 1976. European Union. The copyright law of the European Union is the copyright law applicable within the European Union. Copyright law is largely harmonized in the Union, although country-to-country differences exist. The body of law was implemented in the EU through a number of directives, which the member states need to enact into their national law. The main copyright directives are the Copyright Term Directive, the Information Society Directive, and the Directive on Copyright in the Digital Single Market. Copyright in the Union is furthermore dependent on international conventions to which the European Union is a member, such as the TRIPS Agreement, and conventions to which all member states are parties, such as the Berne Convention. Copyright in communist countries. Further information, copyright in Russia, copyright law of the Soviet Union, and intellectual property in China. Copyright in Japan. Japan was a party to the original Berne Convention in 1899, so its copyright law is in sync with most international regulations. The convention protected copyrighted works for 50 years after the author's death, or 50 years after publication for unknown authors and corporations. However, in 2004 Japan extended the copyright term to 70 years for cinematographic works. At the end of 2018, as a result of the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, the 70-year term was applied to all works. 152. This new term is not applied retroactively. Works that had entered the public domain between 1999 and 2018 by expiration would remain in the public domain. Censorship. Soviet poet Anna Akhmatova, 1922, whose works were condemned and censored by the Stalinist authorities. Further information: book censorship, theater censorship, and film censorship. Censorship of literature is employed by states, religious organizations, educational institutions, etc., to control what can be portrayed, spoken, performed, or written. 153. Generally, such bodies attempt to ban works for political reasons, or because they deal with other controversial matters such as race or sex. 154. A notable example of censorship is James Joyce's novel Ulysses, which has been described by Russian-American novelist Vladimir Nabokov as a divine work of art and the greatest masterpiece of 20th-century prose. 155. It was banned in the United States from 1921 until 1933 on the grounds of obscenity. Nowadays it is a central literary text in English literature courses throughout the world. 156. Awards. There are numerous awards recognizing achievements and contributions in literature. Given the diversity of the field, awards are typically limited in scope, usually on form, genre, language, nationality, and output, d.g. for first-time writers or debut novels. 157. The Nobel Prize in Literature was one of the 6 Nobel Prizes established by the will of Alfred Nobel in 1895, 158, and is awarded to an author on the basis of their body of work, rather than to, or for, a particular work itself. Note 2. Other literary prizes for which all nationalities are eligible include the Neustadt International Prize for Literature, the Man Booker International Prize, Pulitzer Prize, Hugo Award, Guardian First Book Award, and the Franz Kafka Prize. Abraham Harold Maslow, Maslow, April 1, 1908 to June 8, 1970, was an American psychologist who created Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a theory of psychological health predicated on fulfilling innate human needs in priority, culminating in self-actualization. 1. Maslow was a psychology professor at Cornell University, Brooklyn College, Brandeis University, the New School for Social Research, and Columbia University. He stressed the importance of focusing on the positive qualities in people, as opposed to treating them as a bag of symptoms. 2. A review of General Psychology survey, published in 2002, ranked Maslow as the 10th most cited psychologist of the 20th century. 3. Biography. Youth. Born in 1908 and raised in Brooklyn, New York, Maslow was the oldest of 7 children. His parents were first-generation Jewish immigrants from Kiev, then part of the Russian Empire, now Kiev, Ukraine, who fled from Tsarist persecution in the early 20th century. 4. 5. They had decided to live in New York City and in a multi-ethnic, working-class neighborhood. 6. His parents were poor and not intellectually focused, but they valued education. He had various encounters with anti-Semitic gangs who would chase and throw rocks at him. 7. Maslow and other young people with his background were struggling to overcome such acts of racism and ethnic prejudice in an attempt to establish an idealistic world based on widespread education and economic justice. Editorializing. 8. The tension outside his home was also felt within it. He rarely got along with his mother and eventually developed a strong revulsion towards her. He is quoted as saying, What I had reacted to was not only her physical appearance, but also her values and worldview, her stinginess, her total selfishness, her lack of love for anyone else in the world, even her own husband and children, her narcissism, her Negro prejudice, her exploitation of everyone, her assumption that anyone was wrong who disagreed with her, her lack of friends, her sloppiness and dirtiness. He also grew up with few friends other than his cousin Will, and as a result, he grew up in libraries and among books. 9. It was here that he developed his love for reading and learning. He went to Boys High School, one of the top high schools in Brooklyn, where his best friend was his cousin Will Maslow. 10. 11. Here, he served as the officer to many academic clubs and became editor of the Latin magazine. He also edited Principia, the school's physics paper, for a year. 12. He developed other strengths as well. As a young boy, Maslow believed physical strength to be the single most defining characteristic of a true male, hence, he exercised often and took up weightlifting in hopes of being transformed into a more muscular, tough-looking guy. However, he was unable to achieve this due to his humble-looking and chaste figure as well as his studiousness. 13. College and University. Maslow attended the City College of New York after high school. In 1926, he began taking legal studies classes at night in addition to his undergraduate course load. He hated it and almost immediately dropped out. In 1927, he transferred to Cornell but left after just one semester due to poor grades and high costs. 14. He later graduated from City College and went to graduate school at the University of Wisconsin, UW, to study psychology. In 1928, he married his first cousin, Bertha, who was still in high school. The pair had met in Brooklyn years earlier. 15. Maslow's psychology training at UW was decidedly experimental behaviorist. 16. At Wisconsin, he pursued a line of research that included investigating primate dominance behavior and sexuality. Maslow's early experience with behaviorism would leave him with a strong positivist mindset. 17. Upon the recommendation of Professor Halsey Kaysen, Maslow wrote his master's thesis on learning, retention, and reproduction of verbal material. 18. Maslow regarded the research as embarrassingly trivial, but he completed his thesis in the summer of 1931 and was awarded his master's degree in psychology. He was so ashamed of the thesis that he removed it from the psychology library and tore out its catalog listing. 19. However, Kaysen admired the research enough to urge Maslow to submit it for publication. Maslow's thesis was published as 2 articles in 1934, citation needed. Academic career. Maslow continued his research on similar themes at Columbia University. There he found another mentor in Alfred Adler, one of Sigmund Freud's early colleagues. From 1937 to 1951, Maslow was on the faculty of Brooklyn College. His family life and his experiences influenced his psychological ideas. After World War II, Maslow began to question how psychologists had come to their conclusions, and though he did not completely disagree, he had his own ideas on how to understand the human mind. 20. He called his new discipline humanistic psychology. Maslow was already a 33-year-old father and had 2 children when the United States entered World War II in 1941. He was thus ineligible for the military. However, the horrors of war inspired a vision of peace in him, leading to his groundbreaking psychological studies of self-actualizing, editorializing. The studies began under the supervision of 2 mentors, anthropologist Ruth Benedict and Gestalt psychologist Max Wertheimer, whom he admired both professionally and personally. They accomplished a lot in both realms. Being such wonderful human beings also inspired Maslow to take notes about them and their behavior. This would be the basis of his lifelong research and thinking about mental health and human potential. 21. Maslow extended the subject, borrowing ideas from other psychologists and adding new ones, such as the concepts of a hierarchy of needs, meta-needs, metamotivation, self-actualizing persons, and peak experiences. He was a professor at Brandeis University from 1951 to 1969. He became a resident fellow of the Laughlin Institute in California. In 1967, Maslow had a serious heart attack and knew his time was limited. He considered himself to be a psychological pioneer, fact or opinion. He pushed future psychologists by bringing to light different paths to ponder. 22. He built the framework that later allowed other psychologists to conduct more comprehensive studies. Maslow believed that leadership should be non-intervening. Consistent with this approach, he rejected a nomination in 1963 to be the Association for Humanistic Psychology president because he felt the organization should develop an intellectual movement without a leader. 23. Death. While jogging, Maslow had a severe heart attack and died on June 8, 1970, at the age of 62 in Menlo Park, California. 24. 25. He is buried at Mount Auburn Cemetery. Maslow's contributions. Humanistic psychology. Most psychologists before him had been concerned with the abnormal and neo. He urged people to acknowledge their basic needs before addressing higher needs and ultimately self-actualization. He wanted to know what constituted positive mental health. Humanistic psychology gave rise to several different therapies, all guided by the idea that people possess the inner resources for growth and healing and that the point of therapy is to help remove obstacles to individuals achieving them. The most famous of these was client-centered therapy developed by Carl Rogers. The basic principles behind humanistic psychology are simple. Someone's present functioning is their most significant aspect. As a result, humanists emphasize the here and now instead of examining the past or attempting to predict the future. To be mentally healthy, individuals must take personal responsibility for their actions, regardless of whether the actions are positive or negative. Each person, simply by being, is inherently worthy. While any given action may be negative, these actions do not cancel out the value of a person. The ultimate goal of living is to attain personal growth and understanding. Only through constant self-improvement and self-understanding can an individual ever be truly happy. 26. Humanistic psychology theory suits people who see the positive side of humanity and believe in free will. This theory clearly contrasts with Freud's theory of biological determinism. Another significant strength is that humanistic psychology theory is compatible with other schools of thought. Maslow's hierarchy is also applicable to other topics, such as finance, economics, or even in history or criminology. Humanist psychology, also coined positive psychology, is criticized for its lack of empirical validation and therefore its lack of usefulness in treating specific problems. It may also fail to help or diagnose people who have severe mental disorders. 26. Humanistic psychologists believe that every person has a strong desire to realize their full potential, to reach a level of self-actualization. The main point of that new movement, that reached its peak in the 1960s, was to emphasize the positive potential of human beings. 27. Maslow positioned his work as a vital complement to that of Freud. It is as if Freud supplied us the sick half of psychology and we must now fill it out with the healthy half. 28. However, Maslow was highly critical of Freud, since humanistic psychologists did not recognize spirituality as a navigation for our behaviors. 29. To prove that humans are not blindly reacting to situations, but trying to accomplish something greater, Maslow studied mentally healthy individuals instead of people with serious psychological issues. He focused on self-actualizing people. Self-actualizing people indicate a coherent personality syndrome and represent optimal psychological health and functioning. 30. This informed his theory that a person enjoys peak experiences, high points in life when the individual is in harmony with themselves and their surroundings. In Maslow's view, self-actualized people can have many peak experiences throughout a day while others have those experiences less frequently. 31. He believed that psychedelic drugs like LSD and psilocybin can produce peak experiences in the right people under the right circumstances. 32. Peak and plateau experiences. Beyond the routine of needs fulfillment, Maslow envisioned moments of extraordinary experience, known as peak experiences, which are profound moments of love, understanding, happiness, or rapture, during which a person feels more whole, alive, self-sufficient and yet a part of the world, more aware of truth, justice, harmony, goodness, and so on. Self-actualizing people are more likely to have peak experiences. In other words, these peak experiences, or states of flow, are the reflections of the realization of one's human potential and represent the height of personality development. 33. In later writings, Maslow moved to a more inclusive model that allowed for, in addition to intense peak experiences, longer-lasting periods of serene being cognition that he termed plateau experiences. 34. 35. He borrowed this term from the Indian scientist and yoga practitioner, U. A. Asrani, with whom he corresponded. 36. Maslow stated that the shift from the peak to the plateau experience is related to the natural aging process, in which an individual has a shift in life values about what is actually important in one's life and what is not important. In spite of the personal significance with the plateau experience, Maslow was not able to conduct a comprehensive study of this phenomenon due to health problems that developed toward the end of his life. 35. B-values. In studying accounts of peak experiences, Maslow identified a manner of thought he called being cognition, or B-cognition, which is holistic and accepting, as opposed to the evaluative, deficiency cognition, or decognition, and values he called being values. 37. He listed the B values as truth, honesty, reality, simplicity, richness, oddness, beauty, pure, clean and unadulterated, completeness, essentiality, goodness, greatness, desirability, oddness, justice, benevolence, honesty, beauty, greatness, form, aliveness, simplicity, richness, wholeness, perfection, completion, uniqueness, honesty, wholeness, unity, integration, tendency to oneness, interconnectedness, simplicity, organization, structure, dichotomy, transcendence, order, aliveness, process, non-deadness, spontaneity, self-regulation, full function.